When the unsolved cases go cold, they eventually end up in this small room. Inside the boxes,
the paper's even old.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Files where you can see and almost smell the time that's passed.
A heart-wrenching tragedy comes to a family's doorstep.
Tonight on a 40-year-old
His death was a homicide, but his killer
and
remains
when
on the
police
loose.
can't find the murderer,
Police are telling us as many as 10
this was the most heinous, cold-blooded murder case he's ever encountered.
You stab, you stab, you stab.
According tonight, an arrest in the rape and murder of a woman killed 17 years ago.
Start whispering among themselves and pointing fingers at those tips and tails lead nowhere.
You may not remember their names, but these are the faces of hundreds of victims who've been murdered.
1975.
Cops say an unexpected break in this tragic cold case
40 years ago.
Their cases remain unsolved.
Even though they couldn't tie anyone to the crime.
We have a lot of information.
Hundreds of murder cases yet to be solved.
We're always a little bit short of putting
rumors started coming in, or the stories started coming in from the street.
Maybe their conscience just got to them after all these years. That, you know what, maybe I better talk.
Why would you keep this information if you have it? Why would you keep it? A man has died here. Let's bring it to the surface.
She deserves justice. This needs to be solved.
This podcast covers a double homicide that occurred in Wildwood, Florida in 1972. There have been no arrests in this case. All individuals are considered innocent until proven otherwise in a court of law. Wildwood in Sumter County, Florida, was described by a newspaper reporter in 1972 as a predominantly agricultural area with rural attitudes. Rural attitudes, that's one of those phrases that you think you instinctively understand, but when pressed for a specific definition, you, or rather I, have a hard time putting words to it. It's a phrase that is seemingly charged with historical context. But for our purposes, a rural society boasts a lower ratio of inhabitants to open land. Translation: plenty of elbow room. Essentially, you like your neighbors, but you like 'em over there. Not so close that they're all up in your business, if you get my drift. But when we are talking about rural areas and crime, we're talking about things like plenty of places to hide a body. We're talking about how it's easier to get away with things when there's nobody right there on top of you to see what you're getting up to. Unless you've lived in a rural area, it's hard to get the scope of how easily things can go wrong when the terrain is just not in your favor, when help is further away than a scream in the night can travel. This story begins at a 76-station truck stop in 1972 at the junction of I-75 and State Road 44. Essentially, it's a pit stop on the way to somewhere else for almost everyone that passed through. But one man's pit stop is another man's home. 19-year-old Shirley Whitten worked the night shift in the general merchandise section of the 76 truck stop, which also had a restaurant and other amenities for truckers. And on the evening of February 22nd, 1972, Roger Dale Higgins pulled into the lot of that 76 station with his boss, a fellow employee for a moving company, hoping to grab some rest before getting back on the road. It was a pit stop for Roger, and his fate was sealed by chance. He was new to his job, not familiar with the area, and he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. With Shirley Whitten, it was less about chance, because it's pretty clear to everyone involved that she was the intended target that night.
Shirley and I were high school friends. We hung about with, a group of other girls and guys, but we were all together.
Tell me what you remember about her personality. What was she like?
Oh my, she was bubbly. I don't think she ever walked anywhere. She more like ran or hopped or skipped. I mean, even as a high school junior and senior, she was just always going. Bubbly, bright, full of life, ready to do anything at all.
Prior to the night that we're going to talk about in a minute, had you ever been to the Oak Grove Cemetery?
Oh, yes.
So It was, like the newspaper said, sort of a lover's lane type place or a hangout or what?
It was a lover's lane hangout.
From the Orlando Sentinel on Sunday, April 16th, 1972, 2 months after the murders.
Roger Dale Higgins, 26, was a truck driver working out of Fort Lauderdale. Shirley Elizabeth Whitten, 19 and pretty, was the cashier and waitress at a truck stop just off Interstate 5 near Wildwood. They met over a cup of coffee on February 22nd. Sometime that night, they got into Miss Whitten's car and drove about 2 miles west toward the gloomy Oak Grove Cemetery, a strange trysting place. Early the next morning, their mangled bodies were found sprawled next to the girl's car in the cemetery. Miss Whitten was semi-nude, but Higgins' body was fully clothed. The murderer had hacked the young couple to death, slashing at them repeatedly. Then, with his madman's fury still unfulfilled, he slashed all 4 tires of Miss Whitten's car. Higgins' body bore 20 knife wounds. Miss Whitten had been stabbed and slashed 40 times. The motive was not clear then, and it's not clear now. Police could only speculate that a Jack the Ripper was roaming the tranquil byways of Florida.
The Oak Grove Cemetery is located in Sumter County, Florida, at the west end of what was known as the Ice Plant Road back in the day. It's in an isolated area in the north end of the county and was surrounded in 1972 by pasture land. It still is today, for the most part. Now, essentially that road dead ends into the cemetery, encircles the cemetery in what I can best describe for you as a capital P shape. When the investigator arrived on scene, the weather was clear, around 76 degrees, and there was no evidence of precipitation over the previous 8-hour period. He found a dark blue 1963 Chevrolet Bel Air, 4-door, parked on the Lime Rock Road. I would describe its position as being parked in the part of the P shape where the Lime Rock Road circles around and intersects itself, just before the car would pull back out onto the Ice Plant Road. The bodies of Shirley Whitten and Roger Higgins laid a couple feet from the driver's side of the vehicle, nearer to the rear driver's side door. Roger was face down, fully clothed. They would later find that his zipper was down. Shirley was lying partially on her left side and back, resting against Roger's right leg. Shirley wore a flannel shirt and sweater, but was nude from the waist down. Her pants were found beneath her right leg. Shirley's underwear were located in the grass about 3 feet east of her head. The state of the car doors was this. On the driver's side, the front door was closed tight, but it wasn't locked, although its window was rolled down about a half an inch. No other windows in the vehicle were rolled down. On the passenger side of the vehicle, the front door was closed tight and it was locked. The rear passenger door was ajar, but it was also locked. So you know how you sort of don't close a door all the way, but it's locked? That's how they found it. Dried blood was found on the driver's side rear door and the door handle, as well as they found blood splotches on the left rear quarter panel. No blood was found inside the vehicle at all. All 4 tires were flat, and they all had puncture marks. There was blood around one of those puncture marks. About 10 feet west of the passenger side rear quarter panel, they found Shirley's knee-high boots in a grassy area, along with her bobby socks and rubber bands, which I presume were used to hold the socks up inside her boots. There was no blood found on her boots or her socks. So the footwear is on the passenger side or the opposite side of the vehicle where the bodies were found. Oddly, a pair of brown men's terry cloth bedroom slippers were found at the scene, one about 25 feet behind Shirley's car, and the other about 10 feet in front of it. Testing would later reveal one, quote, negroid hair found on one of the slippers. Roger's wallet was found inside the car, beneath the front seat and the driver's side door. Shirley's purse was found on the front seat, and her car had bench seats, the long seats rather than the bucket seats that most vehicles have today. Just to give you a little color, so you can close your eyes and picture it, her purse was made of a pair of cut-off jeans, and she wore love beads around her neck. She also wore her 1970 Wildwood class ring on her finger. Her pants were hip huggers and the boots were knee-highs, black with flowers. It's quintessential early 1970s. It definitely has a hippie vibe, and she would actually later be described as being part of the hippie movement in a criminal profile that was done that we'll discuss later on. Inside the car, they found a sweetheart paper cup on the front floorboard that they would eventually trace back to having come from the truck stop. It had contained soda, but the cup had been spilled, and there were spots of soda on the dashboard, the front seat, and the floor. They noted that the spots on the front seat did not appear to have been sat in since it was spilled. Notably missing from that car were the ignition keys, and those keys would never be found, despite them having searched the area of the cemetery and the surrounding pasture land on foot and with a metal detector. No murder weapon was ever found either, and they speculated in newspaper reports that it was perhaps a pocket knife. Found leading from Shirley's vehicle on the Lime Rock or two-track road to a point at its intersection with the Blacktop Road were splotches of blood that they would later determine were Roger's. That blood trail traveled down the ice plant or cemetery entrance road for about 150 feet from the vehicle, and it ended at a larger area of blood on the ice plant road. There were tire impressions discovered at the cemetery that veered off into the grass on both sides of Shirley's vehicle, and it appears that the route of those tire impressions was that the vehicle came up in the grass alongside Shirley's driver's side. It then did a U-turn around her vehicle and drove back past the passenger side of her car. Where the tire tracks encounter the Lime Rock portion or the two-track portion of the road between the grass, the impressions left were black skid marks. So at the arrival of the curved portion of that U-turn, it seems that someone had gunned the gas. Measurements of the tire impressions show that, quote, they would have been left by a vehicle measuring approximately 4 feet, 10.5 inches at its widest point, indicating to them that it was a small or economy class type vehicle. I have to say that while there are 2 homicide victims in this case, much of the information in the case file and the investigation pertained directly to Shirley Whitten, and that's because police believed that she was the intended target, and the case facts do seem to bear that out. She was the local. Roger Higgins just happened to be passing through. Because of that, police spent very little time on Roger's victimology. However, they did track down the man that he was working with that weekend for the moving company, and they did interview him.
Marion Wallace was employed by Beacon's Van Lines. He was the truck driver, and Roger Dale Higgins was his helper. He stated that on February 18th, which was a Friday, he was in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He stopped in the Beacon's office looking for a helper. He stated that at that time, Roger Dale Higgins was sitting in the office, and he hired him on the spot. He stated that on Saturday they loaded furniture out of the Gulf Ocean Hotel in Fort Lauderdale and then drove to Tampa on Sunday. On Monday, they loaded again in Tampa and left Tampa approximately 6:30 or 7 on Monday night, February 21st. Their destination was Atlanta, Georgia. However, when they arrived at Wildwood around 8 p.m., he decided that they would lay over there since the loading of the truck had tired both of them immensely. He stated that on arriving at the truck stop, he and Mr. Higgins approached the desk to see if they had any rooms available on this night. The answer was negative, so they decided to have dinner and then they would make up the beds in the truck. He stated there was no place to sit at the counter, so they went back out to the truck, and Mr. Wallace made a bed for Mr. Higgins in the trailer portion. He stated that Mr. Higgins said it was too early for him to go to bed, and that he thought he would go up and watch television in the lounge. Mr. Wallace said that he accompanied Mr. Higgins upstairs to the lounge, and they watched television until around 11:50 p.m., at which time Mr. Higgins said that he was hungry, and he was going downstairs to see if he could get a sandwich. He remained watching television for another 20 or 30 minutes, and then he too decided to go downstairs and get a sandwich before retiring for the evening. Upon coming downstairs, he said that he saw Mr. Higgins standing at the counter talking to a young woman. He stated that he didn't speak to his helper or the young lady, but he proceeded to the counter, he ate a sandwich, and then he retired for the evening in the sleeper portion of his cab. He said that upon awakening the next morning, he went to the trailer area to get Mr. Higgins up, and he found that the trailer had not been opened. He said that he also found that the bed had not been slept in. He waited and then he asked questions around the truck stop about Mr. Higgins until around 10 a.m., at which time he left a note on the bulletin board and then proceeded on to his next stop in Atlanta, Georgia. He said that upon arriving in Atlanta, he placed a call to the Wildwood truck stop to see if his helper was there or if he had hitched a ride to Atlanta, and he was informed at that time that the sheriff's deputies from Sumter County had been asking questions in regards to a young man that fit the description of his helper.
So let's look at the days and hours leading up to their bodies being discovered in the cemetery around 8:15 that morning on February 22nd, 1972, and look at what was going on in Shirley's life up to the point her path intersected with Roger Dale Higgins. This cemetery was out of the way. It's not somewhere that a random murderer was likely to encounter the pair, particularly at 3 a.m. I think it's most likely that this person went looking for Shirley at the truck stop, and may have even been there watching as she left the parking lot with Roger. I did speak with someone who was familiar with the truck stop back then, and I asked if you could see into where Shirley worked, meaning were there large windows, and she said yes. So it's possible that someone could have been watching from inside, in the restaurant or the store, or outside. Someone had already been up to the truck stop that night looking for Shirley, about an hour and a half before she was to clock in. Two someones, actually. Cousins. Their names were Daryl and Roy. Daryl was, in fact, a boy that Shirley had dated on and off since early December, when she moved back to town from Ocala, where she had been living and working for a time. And that's just about 3 months before the murders occurred. Shirley and Daryl started dating around December 10th, according to the police report. At the end of January, on a Friday night, Robert Wells went out with Shirley, and on that date he asked her out for another date for the upcoming Sunday, but she told him that she was interested in Daryl and that they were going steady. However, the words going steady might be the words of the investigator because this came from the summary. Robert did mention to police that on that occasion he and Shirley had seen Daryl that night at the drive-in in Webster, while the two of them were out together. A couple weeks after that, on February 15th, Daryl says that Shirley picked him up at his house around 9 in the evening and they went to a shop and go to get Cokes. And then they drove back to his house and drank the Cokes in her car in front of his house and talked. He says that this is the last time he sees Shirley, and according to him, she leaves around 11:30 p.m. A few days later, on February 19th, Robert Wells was up at the truck stop with 3 other guys, and he told police that on this evening he asked Shirley again if she was going steady with Daryl, but this time she said no. So he took a shot and he asked her out again. Shirley said yes, and they made a date for later that evening once she got off work. But when Robert returned at midnight, he was disappointed because Shirley said that when she'd called her mom to say that she was going out, her mother said, "Oh, no, you're not. You're coming straight home." So Robert saw her the next day on Sunday, February 20th. He went to Shirley's house that afternoon around 1:30 with a guy named Ronald, and they, along with Shirley's sister, Joyce, went for a drive and got Cokes. Shirley had to be at work that day at 4, so they returned to her house in Coleman around 3:30. This is the last time that Robert would see Shirley, and I should note that Robert had an alibi for all of the relevant time period. He was at work at Central Packing from 6 p.m. to 7 a.m., and police checked him off their list. So that's Shirley's timeline leading up to Monday, February 21st, 1972, and I think it might be best illustrated from here on out to show how Shirley's evening played out in relation to Daryl and Roy's night. And remember, Daryl is the last guy that she dated regularly for any length of time, and Roy is his cousin. So around 5 that night, Roy and Daryl were headed home to Bushnell in Roy's car after working in Leesburg all day. They said they happened to run into Debbie and Michelle, and all 4 were interviewed, and they agreed that their evening started at the girls' Leesburg apartment.
I came home from work And Debbie had said, hey, you want to go out tonight? There are two guys coming over, and I'm going out with one. Do you want to come with? And I said, sure, why not? What are we going to do? She said, we're just going to go ride around. And ride around meant ride around Leesburg, and then go into Sumter County through the back roads, run around Bushnell for a little while, come through Coleman, head out towards Wildwood. And in doing that, we were in Wildwood at the time, and I said, hey, why don't we go out to the truck stop? Either I said it or somebody said it. I said, well, I have a friend that works out there. Oh, really? Who works out there? I said, my friend Shirley. And it was either Daryl or Roy said, yeah, I used to date her. So that's where we went. I said, I have a friend out there, Shirley. I said, we can go out there. I can say hey to Shirley. And, oh, well, I used to date her. I said, really? And the other one kind of said, yeah, he was in love with her. And whether he was kidding or what, I don't know. But anyways, we went out there, went to the bathroom out there, played with the perfume machine in the ladies' restroom. We came out, couldn't find the guys, so we went over into the food section. On the way, I happened to ask the employee behind the desk there in the clothing section if Shirley was working. And he said, yeah, but she's on break. So we continued our way trying to find Roy and Daryl. We were out there for maybe half an hour, 45 minutes, and we left. And we continued downtown Wildwood, and it's late. It's very late. So, just continued to ride around. They were doing some marijuana. We rode around for maybe another hour and a half. We had been out to the cemetery after leaving the truck stop. We'd been out to the cemetery and drove around a little bit. We didn't stop. But like I said, we drove around. We didn't see anybody, and we left.
So around 6:30 or 7, Wayne, also known as Red, and Shirley left her home in Coleman and they traveled to the Bushnell area. They went to an area called Krumakuchi and then to a drive-in in Bevel's Corner, about 7 miles away. By 10 p.m., Red and Shirley were at the house of a guy named Howell, where a group of guys were hanging out, all who would have been familiar to or friends with Roy and Daryl. At 11 p.m., Red dropped Shirley at her home in Coleman so she can get ready for work, and her parents verified that he did in fact bring her home. She got ready for work and then left. 11:30 or 12, Roy and Daryl say that they're back in Leesburg at the girls' apartment, right about the time that Shirley arrives for work. Roy noted in his police report that he dropped Daryl in Webster at his parents' house where he lived around 1 a.m. and reached his own house nearby minutes later. 2 hours later, Shirley and Roger are seen leaving the truck stop in her vehicle at 3 a.m., which is her dinner break. It would be around 4 a.m. or just after that Shirley's family would get the call, waking them up, to tell them that Shirley had not returned from her break. Her brother remembers that call, and here's what he said happened right after that.
My dad got the phone call.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, everybody in the house is up because the phone's ringing and, that time of night. And, I guess they told him that she was missing and was asking, where, was she home, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so I said, well, she may have went home or left work and went with her boyfriend, I didn't know. So anyway, I told him I knew where he lived. So I took my car and I went to his house. It's a trailer, it's a house trailer. So when I get there, there's lights on. So I knock on the door and a woman inside, answers. I don't remember exact words, but it had to be something like, who are you, or whatever. So I told her who I was, and I need to speak to him because Shirley, I didn't know if she knew Shirley or not. I said, Shirley is not at work. But the woman wouldn't open the door. She wouldn't come to the door. She wouldn't open the door, and she refused to wake him up so he could talk to them. So she was the only one that spoke, and basically she was saying, I'm not coming to the door, you need to leave, I'm not waking him up.
Around 6 a.m., Shirley is reported missing to police, and it would be about 2 hours later, around 8 a.m., that the bodies of Roger and Shirley were found in the cemetery by a man named Horace Crenshaw, who was there to tend to his father's grave before work. He drove past Shirley's car on the right side, the opposite side of their bodies, but did not see the bodies until he made that left turn back onto the blacktop, and I don't think he was exactly sure what he was seeing or didn't want to believe it. But he was concerned enough that he drove to the first road, made a left, and knocked on the first neighbor's door, asking her to call the sheriff's department because, quote,
either someone's having a late party or there's trouble at the cemetery. I don't know which.
The next day, I'm at work, and the head operator comes and says, the sheriff's office is on the phone for you. Take the call in my office. Okay, I get up, I leave my position, I go. And the sheriffs say, we need to know your whereabouts last night. We picked up Roy and Daryl outside Oak Grove Cemetery last night. I'm going, what were they doing outside there last night? We left there. And they said, will you please come to Sumter County Sheriff's Department as soon as possible? We get down there, and of course, Debbie's sitting out in the waiting room, and she'd just gotten there, and so had I. And I said, what's going on? And she said, someone was murdered in the cemetery last night. I said, what cemetery? And she said, the cemetery we had gone to last night with Roy and Daryl. She says, I heard they had picked up Roy and Daryl outside the cemetery. I'm going, oh my gosh. So I get in there, and they're telling me that my friend Shirley, who we'd gone out there to see, had been murdered, and that they had picked up Roy and Daryl outside the cemetery, lawyering or whatever. I don't know what they were doing. Shortly after they had received the call. Of course, I told them everything I knew, and they said, well, Roy and Daryl said they left you off at this time. I said, no, sir. I said, they did not. I said, sir, I had to get up and be at work this morning. I said, so when I got home, I looked at the clock to see what time it was. I said, to gauge how long I had to sleep, set my alarm to wake up on time. I says, no, sir, this is the time. And I gave them the time. And they keep telling me, Roy and Daryl said, Roy and Daryl said, Roy and Daryl. I said, no, sir, I cannot. I said, if they're expecting me to lie, I am not going to lie. This is the time. And basically, I got the idea they didn't believe me. We were there for like 3-4 hours that day. So I go to work the next day, and they call again the next day. They want me down to the sheriff's office. I'm going, what the hey? Again, all the questions, all over again, same questions. And again, they're telling me that the times I'm quoting them are not correct because Roy and Daryl say no. And for about a week, they were calling us every day to go down and repeat the same story over and over again.
I have the summaries that the police put together of all the interviews that they did. And I want to read you what it says for Roy and Daryl, what they said.
Okay.
Daryl says that he and his cousin Roy were returning to Bushnell from Leesburg at around 5 p.m. on the 21st of February when they happened to run into two young ladies that Roy was supposed to have known. Daryl states that he and his cousin accompanied these girls to their apartment in Leesburg. According to Daryl, he, his cousin, and the two young ladies then left the ladies' apartment, driving a vehicle belonging to one of the women. And you said it wasn't your car, one of your cars. You said it was their car.
it wasn't my car, and it wasn't Debbie's either. It was theirs.
According to Daryl, he, his cousin, and the two girls then left the lady's apartment driving a vehicle belonging to one of the women. They proceeded to a hamburger shop in Leesburg, and from the hamburger shop drove on to the area of Wildwood. Daryl stated that he doesn't know which of the four of them suggested it, but they proceeded to the Wildwood truck stop, arriving there at or around 10:30 p.m. He states that while the two women went into the restroom, he and his cousin approached the cashier in the merchandise portion of the truck stop and asked for Shirley. He was informed that Shirley was not on duty at this time and would not be in until around midnight. And she, in fact, did not work that night until midnight. He further explains that after this, the four of them left the truck stop. They drove back through Bushnell, and from Bushnell proceeded on to the apartment of the girls in Leesburg. And he said the vehicle that the vehicle that they were driving belonged to Shelley. It was a 1966 Ford Fairlane 4-door light blue in color, is what he said.
Yeah, Debbie and I both had Ford Fairlanes. Hers was 2-door, mine was 4-door.
So he told them it was your car.
Not my car. Believe me, it was not my car.
And who was driving that night?
One of the boys.
One of them. You don't know which one was driving?
No, I would not let anybody drive my car.
And you were not driving?
I was not driving.
Okay, let's go down to what Roy said. He said they decided to go riding around, and they took Shelley's automobile, drove to a hamburger stand in Leesburg, ate a hamburger, and then continued on to the Wildwood area. When he was asked whose idea it was to go to the truck stop, he said it was his cousin Daryl's idea, because he said he had not seen Shirley in a while and wanted to ride out to the truck stop.
I remember that now, yeah, that he hadn't seen her in a while. And that's when the other one started teasing him how he was so in love with her.
These say that they left your house and were back at their own houses in Webster around 1 a.m. And that's 2 hours before she even left the truck stop. So I'm not understanding why they would have been so aggressively interviewing you about the time, because that wouldn't give them any alibi still with you guys, because they were leaving your house 2 hours before the murders even happened.
I think it was later than that.
You think they left later?
I think that they didn't take us home until later, because I didn't have a whole lot of time left to sleep before I had to get up.
So you think it was more around, you had told me too, yeah.
1:30, 2 o'clock.
So basically the things that are interesting to me is you're positive you didn't drive. Is that correct? That night?
I did not drive.
You did not drive, and it wasn't your car. So if they said that, that's not true.
You're correct.
And nowhere in these interviews does it say that you guys stopped at the cemetery, and you're positive you stopped at the cemetery after the truck stop.
But it was like a run through. It was not like we stopped for 20 minutes or so. No, it was, you go, you ride around up there, nobody's there. Okay, fine, let's go,
It sounds more like wanting to see if anyone's up there than, because you guys didn't park, right? He didn't.
No.
Okay, so if there was no park, what's the purpose is just to drive in that circle around and keep going? Like, my question is it possible they were looking for Shirley there?
That I don't know. I felt it was a little insulting that whichever one it was, either Roy or Daryl, that had dated Shirley, that's the one I was in the back seat with.
Oh, okay, you were in the back seat with, that means Roy was driving.
Okay.
Roy would have been driving if you were in the back seat with the one that had gone out with Shirley. Daryl went out with Shirley, not Roy.
Daryl went out with Shirley, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was in the back seat, and see, if that was my car, I'd have been in the front seat.
Well, right.
Driving.
Correct. That seems right. I mean, they outlined their whole stops, every stop that they made, and they conveniently left out the cemetery. Did they ask you if you had been in the cemetery that night?
I want to say they did ask and what we were doing out there. We'd gone up there, not that we had stopped or anything. We were just
driving through,
just hanging out.
Right. Well, they're basically saying they arrived back. You guys arrived back in Leesburg 11:30 or 12, and they came into the apartment and listened to records. Do you remember?
No.
They didn't come in and listen to records. You guys went in, and that's it. They were not in.
That's correct.
The Whitten-Higgins case file included a criminal profile that was done around 1988.
Medical examiner's report. Victim 1, Shirley Whitten, was described as having a total of 30 stab and/or cuts on her body. The locations of these are as follows: 4 stab wounds in the chest at the base of the neck, 19 stab wounds in her back over a large area, 1 stab wound in the right leg above the knee on the inside of the leg, 4 stab wounds in the back of the left leg, 2 stab wounds in the outside of the left leg, 1 cut or stab wound in the backside of her left wrist. It is reported by the pathologist that all of the wounds, both on victim 1 and victim 2, were caused by the same knife, one weapon, and this knife was described as a double-edged weapon. The stab or cut wounds to the legs, arm, and wrist are indicative of defense wounds, i.e. the victim was down on her back as the offender was stabbing at her. She was using her legs and hands to ward off the blows with the knife. The large area covered by the remaining stab wounds are indicative of a loss of control on the part of the offender. Victim 2, Roger Higgins, had a total of 42 stab wounds on his body. The locations are as follows: 7 stab wounds in the left chest, 35 stab wounds in the back. In addition to the stab wounds, this victim sustained some abrasions. The location of these abrasions are as follows: right elbow and forearm, bottom side, right side of knee, left foot, top of instep.
There was a hole in his left sock over his instep, so the top of his left foot, and he had abrasions on his left foot at the top of his instep, in the same location as where that hole was in his sock.
There were also contusions located on this victim's body, one behind the right ear approximately 1/4 by 3/8 inch, one on the right buttock in a half circle shape.
And his back pocket on the right was split from top to bottom.
The abrasions and contusions are indicative of a physical altercation or fight between this victim and the offender or offenders. The contusion behind his right ear is directly attributed to a blunt force trauma to this location. It is our opinion that there was sufficient force to have rendered him unconscious. Crime scene analysis. On the night of this incident, the victim arrived for work at the appropriate time to begin work at midnight. She was seen talking to a white male, believed to be victim 2, prior to her lunch break. At 3 a.m., the victim's lunch break, the victim was seen leaving the truck stop arm in arm with a white male, believed to be victim 2. Victim 1 was scheduled to be back at work at 4 a.m., however she did not return. Her immediate supervisor telephoned her parents to determine if they had seen the victim. The victim was reported missing by the assistant manager of the Union 76 truck stop at approximately 6 a.m. on February 22, 1972. Both victims' bodies were discovered laying next to Shirley's vehicle, a 1963 Chevrolet 4-door, in the Oak Grove Cemetery. The victims were laying on the driver's side of the vehicle, victim 1 partially laying on victim 2's legs. The vehicle was parked as if it was headed out after having circled around the cemetery. Blood was discovered approximately 50 feet east of the bodies. The blood belonged to victim 2, Roger. Lab examination indicated that there was semen present in the vaginal vault of victim 1, as well as on the underwear of victim 2. An attempt was not made to determine whether the semen was from a common source. However, it is theorized that the victims had had intercourse with each other prior to the approach of the offender or offenders, or were possibly in the process. We do not believe that the offender or offenders either passed the victims on their way to the cemetery or followed them out there. We are more of the opinion that the offender or offenders were just cruising, looking for something to do. More specifically, we believe that the offender or offenders had more than likely closed the local bar, purchased 1 or 2 six-packs of beer, and began cruising as they drank their beer. They drove out to the cemetery knowing this was a favorite hangout for young people, thinking that they might meet some friends or find something else to do.
Now, the analysts do not expound upon why they didn't think Roger and Shirley were followed from the truck stop. It seems likely that they decided if Shirley was being followed all that way, a drive that I have made, and it's a couple miles along back roads, that the person following them, well, their presence wouldn't have gone unnoticed. I tend to agree about that to some extent, especially at 3 a.m. To this theory, though, it does appear that the offender or offenders went undetected by Shirley and Roger for long enough that they were able to be interrupted in the act. Shirley was not fully dressed.
We do not believe that sex was the motive in this offense. We are more inclined to believe that the motive of this homicide was basically the offender caught an outsider engaged in sex with one of the local girls. This was more a proprietary motive. Theory. Upon victim 1 getting off from work for her lunch break, they, victims 1 and 2, went to the Oak Grove Cemetery, believed for the purpose of having sex. Due to the late night hour and short time, they did not go all the way into the cemetery, but rather parked on the hard-surfaced road and engaged in sexual activities. In close proximity to completing sex, the victims were approached by the offender or offenders. The male victim stepped out of the car to converse with them and was assaulted. During this assault, victim 1 attempted to drive away from the area, and during this initial attempt, victim 2 tried to get back into the vehicle, leaving his blood on the left rear door. Victim 1 was successful in getting the vehicle started and drove west on Ice Plant Road and then turned north into the cemetery and circled around to exit. When the offender or offenders observed the vehicle leaving, one maintained control over victim 2, which was already injured, and the other pursued victim 1 in the offender's vehicle. Rather than following victim 1 around the cemetery, the offender cut across between the headstones and basically cut her off. As victim 1 stopped her vehicle, the offender pulled around and got up on the left side of the driver's side, and at this point got out and punctured all 4 tires of the victim's vehicle. In addition to puncturing the tires, just to be safe, the offender reached in the vehicle and took the keys out of the ignition. At this point, the other offender made victim 2, who was critically injured, walk to the vehicles.
Their theory was that Shirley's car wasn't stopped on the gravel road where it was found the next day, but instead, when the perpetrator or perpetrators approached, the car was parked on Ice Plant Road, the main road into the cemetery, when the offender or offenders came upon the victims. I can only assume that they thought this because it's where the larger amount of blood was found, and that perhaps as soon as Roger got out of the car, that physical altercation ensued. Also, most of their theory seems to rely on there being 2 perpetrators. However, later reinvestigations would focus on a 1 perpetrator theory, so we must also consider that Shirley's vehicle was parked where it was later found when the couple encountered the single offender. And that would basically mean that she had initially driven into the cemetery from the Ice Plant Road and circled around that capital P-shaped gravel road and curved around to stop just before it intersected the Ice Plant Road, leaving her vehicle pointing in the appropriate direction to pull straight forward and take a left to exit when they were ready to leave. Which to me makes more sense. That's probably what I would do. That way you're assured an easy exit, but you can also see other cars approaching. You wouldn't want to be parked on the Ice Plant Road, even on the side of that road, if it's known as a lover's lane, and risk other couples driving right past your window. It seems more reasonable that you would circle the cemetery and find a spot off to the side, which is how I would describe where her vehicle was found the next morning. In that scenario, when the single offender drove up, maybe Roger got out to interact with the offender, a physical altercation ensued, and what began as a fist fight, which is supported by the medical examiner's report, ended with the perpetrator pulling out a weapon, which was not used on the tires until he had already begun stabbing Roger, given that there was blood found next to one of the slits in a tire. That would mean that the blood trail down Ice Plant Road was Roger running away from the vehicle instead of being walked toward it. Perhaps he was running to get help, but stopped for some reason. Maybe the perpetrator ran after him to complete the assault. Maybe that's where he was knocked unconscious, and he laid there long enough that the perpetrator thought he was dead, and then the perpetrator left. Once the perpetrator's gone, maybe Roger got up and stumbled his way back to Shirley, and now they're both critically injured, with no car keys, and a vehicle with flat tires. They're both bleeding out until they collapse right there next to the car.
Offender characteristics and traits. When looking at these homicides, one must consider the possibility of more than one offender. There is nothing specific that indicates there were more than one offender, other than the control needed to deal with both victims. Due to the absence of ligature marks on either victim, we are of the opinion that there were 2 offenders.
While the control aspect makes sense when theorizing 2 offenders, I think it's important to note that a great deal of control related to Shirley's movements, at least, could be attributed to her state of undress. Based on her boots appearing to have been thrown out of the vehicle 10 feet west of it, and her underwear and pants being on the other side of the vehicle, we can theorize that that fact alone controlled her to some extent, keeping her inside the car for some period of time, maybe even trying to lock herself in, given that the 2 passenger side doors had the locks engaged. However, their theory suggested that Shirley at least tried to get into the front seat and drive the vehicle away. That seems possible, given that soda, which was overturned in the front seat, and it had splashed on the dash, on the floor, and it had caused puddles in the driver's seat. Those puddles were described as not having been sat upon, so that could have happened while she was clambering over the seat from the back, where they had been seated when interrupted. Or it could have spilled if she had gunned the gas as she tried to get away, as they outline in the profile. In that event, it would likely mean that Shirley was pulled out of the driver's door, since the passenger front door was locked, and the report notes that the puddles on the seat were not disturbed. The back driver's door, with Roger's blood on the handle and smeared near the right quarter panel, could have been him trying to get back in, which would explain why it was ajar. But there was no blood found inside the vehicle, none, so he was never able to get inside, and that suggests that no part of the stabbing occurred while either victim was inside the vehicle. None of Shirley's footwear had blood on it either. As for the theory of Shirley trying to get away in the vehicle, that would also explain the tires being slashed and the keys being removed. I'm not sure any perpetrator would feel the need to do both unless he believed that they were either able or actively trying to get away.
Available research indicates that crimes of this nature typically occur along interracial lines, i.e. black on black and white on white. Based on the information presented, the behavior exhibited at the crime scene, and owing to a lack of forensic evidence to the contrary, it is felt that this holds true for this specific case, and that the offender or offenders are white males. The house slippers found at the crime scene were considered. However, it is our opinion that they are artifact, having nothing to do with the homicide.
Remember, there was what they called a, quote, negroid hair on one of the slippers, so that very likely played into why they felt that the slippers were not related, and that's possible. However, their location bears repeating. One slipper was about 25 feet directly behind her car, and the other was about 10 feet in front of it. Since her own boots were about the same distance from at least one of those slippers, I don't think we can so easily dismiss it. Also, when we're talking about footwear, we can assume that there will be all kinds of hair and fibers found on a cloth shoe. I don't necessarily think that that means that the person who was wearing those slippers or left them was black.
For fun and excitement, your offender is going to be a cruiser. He's going to habitually drive around looking for something to do. Additionally, he is going to do this late at night until early in the morning. Due to the fact that the truck stop is probably about all there was open in that area, he would have been a frequent fixture there. The possibility exists that he either filled up with gas and or had something to eat there prior to the homicides. He may have been in there earlier, prior to victim 1's lunch break, and saw the 2 victims talking to each other. Then when he drove by at a later time and saw the victim's vehicle missing, he decided to drive out to the cemetery to see if they could be there. Due to the statements of the investigators in reference to the width of the offender's vehicle, I would suggest that he drove a Mustang, Camaro, Falcon, or some other mid-sized vehicle. This vehicle is going to have been in poor condition and not very well maintained. It is going to be the most the offender can afford.
I understand why, when looking at this case, analysts would make the connection that this offender must be a cruiser, because they've already said that they don't think the perpetrator or perpetrators followed the victim, and the cemetery is very remote. It's also just after 3 a.m., so most people are home in bed at this time. It's a very rural area. So the only thing that makes sense, the only dot that you can connect, is that you've got an offender or offenders that make a habit of driving around in the wee hours of the night, up to drinking and no good. But let me ask you this. Do you think if the FBI analysts who prepared this profile knew at the time that Shirley had dated a young man who lived in a home on property that abutted the cemetery, do you think that might have changed the trajectory of the profile? Now we're going to skip forward about 20 years, during a reinvestigation point. On October 12, 1995 to be exact, there was a note written on one of the fingerprint reports that said,
"Looked at the wrong..."
Beneath that irritating beep is a last name. And it's the last name of one of the handful of guys that were friends with Roy and Daryl, who had all had their fingerprints checked against the unknown prints in Shirley's vehicle. And they ran a bunch of them. It's likely that if you were in their friend group and cops thought that you may have been in the cemetery that night, you had your fingerprints checked back in 1972. And I should probably mention now that the only fingerprint that came back as a match from Shirley's vehicle to anyone tested up to that time was one of Daryl's. It was located in the horn area of the steering wheel. When he was interviewed, he adamantly stated that he had never operated Shirley's vehicle. However, finding his prints in that car really don't mean anything, because Daryl told police that he had been in Shirley's vehicle a week prior to her murder. So for practical reasons, we have to set that data point aside as essentially meaningless. However, that beep meant that in one case they had been looking at the wrong person with the same last name, and as it would turn out, someone bearing that last name had dated Shirley, and according to her brother, was someone who wouldn't take no for an answer. Here's Shirley's brother again.
I was never in trouble with any of the local guys that she knew. Now, the only one that I always have questions about is he was the one she dated for probably longer than any of them.
It's funny because he's the one name that's not on there. I
think he was a year ahead of her.
Were they dating right up to when this...
No, they dated before all of that happened. But again, my assessment of him, though, he was really into her. And little tidbits that pop into mind is, yeah, he was a little controlling. He didn't like the breakup. There should be police interview reports for him. Because I know I would have said it. I know my father would have said it. Because my father wasn't real keen on him either. From what I remember, he lived in that general area. And he just appeared to be, kind of a pushy guy. And, he got mad if he didn't get his way a little bit. So,
was he possessive?
Easily with her rebuffing him and him, because he wasn't happy about it. Because, as I said, he kind of pursued her even though they broke up. And she mentioned it a couple times. So, he was definitely wanting to be part of it.
I mentioned name to a source who had been helping me identify people from the police report because she had known most of the guys mentioned. She had dated Daryl. When I mentioned name, she had a visceral reaction. What followed was the retelling of a horrible incident, but also it included at least one data point that I believe is relevant for its similarity to what may have transpired on the night Shirley and Roger were murdered. This woman told me that had raped her in 1976 while she was pregnant, just 4 years after Shirley's murder. She gave me permission to share her story and I'm going to do so in her own words. The first time I saw him, I was out with a lady friend. I didn't really know her that well. I mean, I knew her, but we had never really hung out. Anyways, we went to a bar. It was a very small bar where you couldn't help but see everybody that's in there, and he was there and she spoke to him. And then she turned to me and she said, "Oh, you should know him. He's your cousin." I've always been very family-oriented, and I thought it was pretty cool to meet a new relative. We only talked for a few minutes and we left, and I didn't see him anymore. Not that night. But the following weekend, I ran into him again at a different bar, and he started talking to me. And when the bar closed, a bunch of people were talking about going to get something to eat, and I was driving my dad's truck, and I knew I couldn't leave it parked anywhere, so I insisted on taking my truck, and he insisted on riding with me. I saw no problem with that. After all, he was my cousin. I can't remember how he got in the driver's seat, but somehow he did, and he suddenly pulled off into an orange grove. I knew what was coming when he did that. I begged and I pleaded. He turned off the truck, and he pulled the keys from the ignition, and he told me if I didn't shut up, he was going to throw the keys out into the orange grove as far as he could throw them. This was my dad's truck, and I knew I couldn't let my dad know that I had somebody else in the truck, and the keys were lost, and my head was going in all directions, and I wanted out of this situation, and so I started talking more calmly to him, being pleasant, not screaming. All of a sudden, he put the keys back in the ignition, and he started the truck up, and he started driving out of the orange grove. But as soon as he hit the pavement, he turned the truck around and went back to the orange grove, and he said,
"I came out here for a reason, and I'm going to do it."
So I grabbed the steering wheel and I tried to turn in the opposite direction and try to wreck us. There was a drop-off in a lake on the other side of the road, and I tried to steer the truck over there. I knew that I would rather die in that lake than let him do this to me. He knocked me over into the passenger side of the truck, and he continued driving deep into the orange grove. I was so desperate I didn't know what to do, so I pretended I was going into labor. But when I did that, he said to me,
"You got yourself into this, bitch. Now get yourself out of it."
She said that afterward, stalked her. It got so bad that once she looked up and she saw him watching her at a bar, and she was with 10 or so friends, and they were all made aware of the rape. They had been. She had told people after it happened. So a couple of her guy friends followed him out into the parking lot. One grabbed a shotgun, and they basically told him in no uncertain terms to leave her the hell alone. Never bothered her again. She spent years trying to forget what happened. She even underwent hypnosis. And then I started asking questions, mentioned his name, and dragged it all back up to the surface. We discussed the incident over a period of days, and at one point I asked her if he had any weapons on him, and she said the second thing that chilled me. She said that second time when he drove back into the orange grove and he parked, he sat there disturbingly calm. He pulled out a pocket knife, and he proceeded to clean his fingernails with it. But the thing that stood out most for me from her story were those keys. How he had pulled them out of the ignition and threatened to toss them into the orange grove where she'd never be able to find them. Because the keys to Shirley's vehicle have never been recovered by police. The similar feature here in both instances is a perpetrator yanking the keys from the ignition to control his victim. And to me, that is a compelling data point. The same day that I heard this woman's rape story, I found an article in the Tampa Bay Times about the case. It featured a story, and alongside it, a large picture of father, Aubrey, standing on the cemetery road, with his pickup truck in the background, pointing down to the still visible blood on the ground. From the point on that road where he was standing, he could have glanced over to his right in a northerly direction and looked straight at his own house, across the pastures. So we're going to talk about Aubrey for a little bit, because his name came up to me a couple times as suggestions of someone who could have something to do with these homicides. Aubrey would most certainly be described in today's law enforcement terms as a local bad actor, meaning that he was someone known to law enforcement and known to offend. The list of his offenses included moonshining and bolita, which is an illegal type of lottery game that he was running out of a store that he owned. But Aubrey's non-violent offenses were peppered in between violent and what I would call violence-adjacent offenses. In 1949, Aubrey and his brother Grady were involved in the shooting of a night watchman and his wife, who were making their rounds that night at a crate factory. Janet Williams had previously worked for Grady. Later at trial, Mrs. Williams would tell the jury that while she worked for him in his store, he tried to kiss her once. After she quit the job, she said Grady came to her apartment and told her that he loved her, and he would pay for a divorce and provide her with a place to stay if she would agree. She refused. 2 nights later, she said that he came back and he wanted her to leave with him. She said he promised to leave her alone afterward if she would just go for a drive with him, just one more time. Mrs. Williams said he drove her to a spot 2 miles from Coleman, into the woods, and there, quote, intimacy occurred. Her husband, Cody Williams, testified on the stand that his wife had admitted to him 2 weeks before the shooting that she had been intimate with Grady. So then he went to see Grady with a note from his wife requesting her former employer to pay him the $3 that was owed to his wife for work. While he was there, he warned Grady to never speak with his wife again. Cody Williams would tell the jury that on the night of the shooting, Grady and Aubrey, who he had never seen before that night, drove up to their store, which was next to the crate factory where he and his wife were making his rounds. When Grady addressed his wife, Mr. Williams said,
I told you, Grady, 2 weeks ago, never to speak to me or my wife again, you dirty dog.
Grady then told his brother Aubrey to hand him a gun. Aubrey reached into the car, loaded a shotgun, handed it to his brother Grady, and said,
Kill 'em both. I've got $20,000 to get you out of it.
A witness who lived nearby, as well as a Coleman police officer, both testified to hearing the shots, and they both said that the shotgun fired first. And then Cody's wife testified that Mrs. Aubrey Barnes came to her house after the shooting and offered her $1,000 and all her expenses paid if she dropped the lawsuit. I should note that at the first trial, both men were found guilty and sentenced to 10 years at Rayford State Prison. But the history of this case included an appeal and then a mistrial. 4 years into the whole process, the brothers were acquitted, and it was learned that they had been out of jail the whole time, quote, at liberty on $8,000 bond that had been put up by businessmen of the county. In the ensuing years, Aubrey and his son-in-law, Georgie Boy Altman, would be arrested for moonshining multiple times, and in one instance, local agents hid and watched a cache of whiskey to see who would come to claim it. It was hidden in a thicket near the Oak Grove Cemetery, in the area where Aubrey's property abutted it. His family was well familiar with that cemetery property. They had probably traversed every foot on many occasions. To support that theory, when Georgie Boy and his partner in crime, Juddy Talbot, were arrested, he said they were out there because Aubrey had asked them to go out and search for a sick cow, and they just happened upon that whiskey. I think they had a bit of a harder time explaining why they'd been seen placing twigs and shrubbery on top of the 28 5-gallon jugs of contraband, and in that case, Aubrey posted bond for them both. Then in 1959, about 10 years after his last violent incident involving a gun, Aubrey, his ever-invested son-in-law Georgie Boy, and a man named James Helton were arrested for attempted murder for the beating and shooting of a black barber in Wildwood, Florida. Georgie Boy had previously been accused of dragging another black man from his jail cell and beating him for making insulting remarks to a white woman. He was, in fact, out on $8,000 bond for that February incident when the assault on the barber occurred. As that story went, a local black woman named Florence Bevels, who owned the tavern outside which this incident occurred, had called police on another black female who was allegedly causing problems at her establishment. Helton, at the request of police, went to investigate. Aubrey and Georgie Boy also showed up separately. Helton drove up as they were getting in the vehicle and had a gun, and he told her he was the law and that she was under arrest. He grabbed the woman. She pulled away. Then one of the other white men, essentially pistol whipped her. Someone in the crowd yelled out,
"That man's not the law,"
causing her common-law husband to retrieve his gun from the car. Witnesses described the violent incident, saying that Georgie Boy had come up behind the black barber and begun beating him in the head with a hoe, as the fake cop/forestry service worker grabbed his weapon from the car. Then the other 2 white men held the barber down while the third shot him in the head. One of those men doing the holding was Aubrey Barnes. After the incident, Georgie Boy, Aubrey's son-in-law, skipped town, and it was interesting to note that police didn't do all that much to go fetch him. In fact, they said publicly,
"He's due in court on Monday. It would put the state to a lot of expense to return him."
Mind you, that trial on Monday that they were affording him the grace to show up for on his word was related to a safe-cracking ring that had been run out of the prison. Most certainly involving prison officials, because the men doing the robbing had been let out at night to perform the local burglaries. But the history of this case included an appeal and then a mistrial. After Aubrey was seen having lunch with some of the jurors right out in public for everyone to see. In the end, the Wildwood police chief at that time, Chief Nix, to his credit, recommended the dismissal of the Wildwood police radio operator named W.H. Burrow, who had sent Helton, our fake policeman, to the scene in the first place. The radio operator's excuse? He said he was, quote, unable to get an officer to go to the scene, so he sent Helton to, quote, tell Aubrey to stay put, and to tell the black women to go home and quit making a disturbance. Chief Nix said that the other officers were out tracking an escapee, a city prisoner. However, they were in separate radio-equipped cars, and neither reported any call from Bro. In addition, the radio log did not show that he had ever made any contact with either. In a newspaper article after the incident, titled "Wildwood Cop Tied to the Klan After Battle," it was revealed that the radio operator who had sent the fake cop/forestry service worker to the incident that day was reported to be a high official in the state, Southern, and national Ku Klux Klan. Only 6 months later, federal agents swarmed Sumter County, rounding up moonshiners and destroying a huge whiskey still. Aubrey was arrested near his home and his car was confiscated by the feds. The newspaper report said, quote,
"The mash was still hot when the agents hit the still."
Aubrey Barnes' story ended 7 years after Shirley Whitten and Roger Higgins were killed in the Oak Grove Cemetery. He left the Wildwood area not long after that double homicide. He met someone around 1973 who he'd marry in the end of 1974, right after his previous wife divorced him. He'd be married to this last wife for about 5 years, until she shot him on November 3, 1979. The newspaper account of the incident said that the couple were at their home in Greenville, Florida, rendering out lard in their yard when the fight began. She grabbed a .22 caliber bolt-action rifle from the porch and shot at her husband twice, missing both times. And when he ran inside, she fired the third shot through the front of the house, and it struck him in the back. She was found guilty of second-degree murder and sent to prison. But her appeal documents indicate that there was a bit more to the story. They reversed her guilty verdict and remanded it for a new trial. They did this because at trial she had testified that Aubrey had a tendency to act violently and had threatened to kill her on previous occasions, as well as the day of the incident, and that he was attempting to get a gun when she shot him. During cross-examination of her daughter from a previous marriage, counsel questioned the daughter regarding an argument that had occurred a week before Aubrey's death. The state objected to this line of questioning, and the court sustained the objection on the grounds that it was irrelevant. The court refused to hear from the witness on that point, and later defense counsel tried to question her on the stand about her knowledge of a previous fight between Aubrey and another man, for which he was facing aggravated assault charges at the time of his death. The court again sustained the state's objection to that testimony. The appeal court, however, agreed with her that the previous lines of questioning were relevant to her claim of self-defense. They said, quote,
"There was no proffer of the excluded testimony, and we are therefore unable to determine whether or not the answers, if given, would have been relevant to show Aubrey's violent nature, of his threats toward his wife, or her knowledge of his violent propensities, and her fear of him. Under the peculiar circumstances of this case, which included evidence that the deceased had been sexually molesting her daughter, we consider that in the interest of justice, she be granted a new trial."
In the end, there was a plea bargain for 4 years in prison. She ended up doing 2. This man, I will remind you, was depicted in a newspaper photo, standing on the cemetery road, pointing to blood on that road, the day after the double homicides in the Oak Grove Cemetery. As I said previously, Aubrey didn't stay in Wildwood much longer after the murders. I found an article in the newspaper dated July of '72, where he was listed as Aubrey Barnes of Marianna, Florida. He had run off the road, hit a telephone pole, went through a fence, and flipped his truck. At the time, he was charged with driving without a license and failure to control his vehicle. No mention of alcohol, although I was told by another witness who often came in contact with him that he always smelled of alcohol. I was also told that Aubrey always carried a pocket knife, although I don't necessarily think that's all that probative, given that I suspect many men who lived in the area at the time did, probably still do. However, when trying to assess motive, means, and opportunity, we can certainly say that Aubrey had the latter two. But motive is where it gets a bit more interesting. Why would Aubrey be involved in any way with the Oak Grove double homicides unless he did so relative to his son? If his son was heartbroken over the breakup, as a family member alleged to me, would Aubrey avenge his son's broken heart, like he did with his brother Grady's? Well, that is the question.
"Kill them both. I've got $20,000 to get you out of it."
Aubrey was never interviewed about this case. We don't know what he or his son would have said in 1972 if they had been questioned about their activities on the evening when Shirley Whitten and Roger Higgins should have returned to the truck stop but didn't. We don't know where Aubrey or his son were between 3 and 4 a.m. because nobody thought to ask that day or in the days to follow. And that, my friends, is the problem with cold cases. A problem that becomes exponentially larger with every passing decade. You can't fix what you failed to do in the first place. In that article from right after the murder, where he's standing there with the reporter pointing down at that blood, they quoted him saying that on many previous nights, his family heard screaming and what sounded like gunshots coming from the area. That sentiment, though, it was repeated in subsequent newspaper articles, and it somehow evolved into neighbors, plural, reported hearing screams and laughter on several occasions, but nothing on the morning of the slayings. Police themselves had said that the cemetery was, quote, a frequent target of vandals due to gravestones being driven over. But who better than people who lived on the property next door to have seen or heard something that night? Who better to know that that area in the cemetery was a popular lover's lane, right up on a little hill that they could see from their yard when anyone drove in? It's hard to imagine 2 people were stabbed over 50 times in total, one even managing to get free and run down the road a bit, bleeding, and the inhabitants of one home right nearby hearing nothing. Neither victim called out that night for help. There were no sounds at all, not even the sound of a vehicle that we know its driver had gunned the gas in an effort to make a speedy getaway. Not a sound, huh? For my part, when I think of Aubrey, I think about those men's slippers that were found in the cemetery, considered by the profilers to be an anomaly. Well, they might be. They might have absolutely nothing to do with those murders. Or it might be that they weren't considered because the profilers didn't have all the information. What if the perpetrator, or one of the perpetrators that night, had been wearing them? Because, let's say, he was in for the night, until suddenly he wasn't. And they ended up one on either side of Shirley's vehicle because there was some active chase going on in the cemetery. and the perpetrator literally ran out of them. The slippers found were slides with no backs and would come off easily. Another thing that I keep coming back to is how Shirley didn't have time to pull her pants on. It's one of the more telling points, as far as I'm concerned. I feel as though the approach of a vehicle, given where her car was found parked, and if that's where the vehicle was when the perpetrator or perpetrators encountered it, it would have been impossible not to see from that vantage point someone approaching, even if the headlights were turned off. That other vehicle would have to drive right past you or directly up next to you, as some of the investigators surmised had occurred based on the tire tracks in the grass around the car. And if that's me in that car, even if I'm not initially scared of who's driving up, even if I think it's another couple, no matter what's going on in that car up to that point, if a car pulls close enough to see into my window, we're done and I'm pulling up my pants. But what if the initial perpetrator didn't arrive by car? What if they arrived on foot, a bit more stealthily, and only sometime after did another perpetrator and vehicle enter the scene? That is certainly one possibility, because how is Shirley not getting dressed if there's only one perpetrator and he's busy with Roger? Common sense tells you you do try to take the male out first because they pose you the most threat. It seems unlikely that he would go after Shirley first, with another able male there to defend her, and that male had been trained in the armed services, no less. Roger was listed in the report as 6 foot and 180 pounds. I've often thought that the perpetrator's first instinct was to yank open one of the doors and grab Shirley's clothing, tossing it far enough away from the vehicle so as to make it impossible for her to get dressed unless she got out of the car, and then he and Roger start fighting, and Shirley can't get out of the car, and she's trying to figure out what to do. Maybe someone heard noises coming from the cemetery, and they went outside to look. And he stood there in his slippers, wondering if he should hop in his vehicle and drive over there and tell those goddamn kids, once and for all, to stop treating the cemetery like their playground. Or maybe he'd seen Shirley's car casting its twin beams along the night sky as it pulled around that capital P, headlights poking at him through the trees. Maybe her car was recognized that night, and someone or someones wanted to know who she was with. How about another maybe while we're here? Shirley was described as leaving the truck stop arm in arm with Roger, and it made me wonder if there was a reason for that. I discussed this aspect with quite a few of the people that I talked to, because there's no way around the fact that leaving work with a man that you've only just met a couple hours before was a poor choice on Shirley's part. It put her at risk. But make no mistake, lest we cast aspersions on the woman for leaving with a man she didn't know. Roger put himself at risk too. He made an equally poor choice. I want to be clear, that's not a judgment, that's a fact, and we're trying to stick to the facts here. But what if there was a reason Shirley was arm in arm with Roger, above and beyond her general exuberance for just being free from work for an hour? What if there was a reason that she had been seen chatting with Roger for much of the time from midnight when she came to work to 3 a.m. when they left together, despite Roger being warned by the night manager twice? What if there was someone up at the truck stop or in the parking lot, someone that Shirley knew and wanted to signal to, in no uncertain terms, that she was not interested? And what if that someone went home, heartbroken over what he saw, or angry, and his father was up and awake? Perhaps it wasn't so much like grabbing a shotgun and saying,
"Go ahead, kill him. I've got 20,000 to get you off."
Maybe it was as simple as grabbing a beer, putting on his slippers and saying,
"You gonna let them make a fool of you, boy?"
Maybe. There are a lot of maybes in this case. If only the trees in the Oak Grove Cemetery could speak, decades of answers would be there for the listening. This cemetery, by the way, is known as the resting place to yet another unsolved homicide victim, a nondescript metal marker reading Jane Doe, discovered on February 19, 1971. 6 months after being found, under the Lake Panasoffkee Bridge in Sumter County. Little Miss Lake Panasoffkee's body was interred at the Oak Grove Cemetery. No next of kin ever came forward to claim her body. She has since been twice exhumed in the hopes of finding more information about her, but her story is still as shrouded in mystery as that of Shirley and Roger. Because it's a small local cemetery, there are others who are tangentially related to the double homicide who are also buried there. Mr. Horace Crenshaw, the man who drove out that morning to tend to his father's grave and found Roger and Shirley. He's there. There's also a woman that Aubrey Barnes had been married to for what I can only assume was a shitty 10 months given the quick divorce and the character of the man that she had been betrothed to. I spent a bit of time on Ancestry.com and found that he had actually married this woman in another county while he was still married to his previous wife. The thing that I feel fairly confident about here is that whoever killed Shirley Whitten and Roger Higgins knew Shirley and felt somehow personally aggrieved. This seems to be a revenge-type killing, and the overkill in this case generally supports that. Add to that the fact that Shirley was new on the job at the truck stop. She'd only been there 2 weeks, and this was only her second overnight shift. That tells me that it was someone who either knew her schedule that night or who would have had to have been watching her at some point that night. Because the only other option is that it was someone that actually saw her drive into the cemetery. The scene and the injuries, they speak to anger. The flattened tires and the keys missing speak to a need for control. As far as Roy and Daryl, well, they can't be ruled out. Daryl's print was found in Shirley's vehicle, but he had been in that car with her the week before. I can picture a scenario where he leans over to kiss her goodbye and touches that steering wheel. And it's possible that Michelle's memories of what vehicle was being driven that night are just mistaken. The fact is, I cannot envision a situation where they would need to get together and lie about which vehicle they were in, because no matter how late they got the girls home that night, whether it was between 1 and 2 like Michelle thought, or they arrived at their own homes by 1 a.m., in either scenario, one or both of them could still have had plenty of time to leave their homes and go up to the cemetery and commit the murders. Those girls were never their alibis either way. Based on my review of the documents in this case, none of the original persons of interest can truly be ruled in or out. So if you have information about the murders of Shirley Whitten and Roger Higgins, please contact Captain John Galvin with the Sumter County Sheriff's Office at 352-569-1600. You can also email Captain Galvin at jgalvin@sumtercountysheriff.org. He was very responsive to my questions, and I'm sure that he would welcome any tips or new information on this case. I've said this before, but I'm going to repeat my plea. Please don't take to the grave what should have been left here. If you believe in a higher power and you're getting up in age, those inner twinges, that's your conscience reminding you that the sand in the hourglass is not in your favor. If you aren't inclined to believe that there's a destination after this life, how about you just make it about someone else, the people who will be left behind, who have a right to know. I may not believe in God, because I don't generally operate out of a concern for my everlasting soul, but I am moved by people. I believe in doing right by them here and now, where it actually matters. And I believe the most generous acts involve lifting the burdens of others when you can, and there is no greater honor than to be able to do that for someone else. Shirley and Roger have living relatives, so if you need a reason to do the right thing, let them be your reason. If you are a family member, friend, or member of law enforcement that is interested in having your case covered on the Down and Away podcast, you can contact me at deckerjenny@gmail.com. If you are interested in fiction, you should check out the Morneau podcast from my Detective Dex Morneau crime series. Both Down and Away and the Morneau podcast can be found wherever you listen to podcasts.